They started with a single photograph, never realizing it would become a decades-long tradition. Year after year, three sisters came together to capture time, but one day, everything changed. The final picture turned out to be the most touching and left everyone speechless. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories and share in the comments. How many years has it been since you last saw your loved ones? The town lay nestled beside a vast lake, its waters shimmering under the golden hues of the setting sun. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower, where the wooden houses bore the marks of generations, and where laughter echoed between narrow streets lined with apple trees. At the heart of this town stood a house, a large, weathered home with white paint peeling from its walls and a garden that smelled of lilacs and freshly turned earth. Inside that house, three sisters grew up together, their childhood filled with endless summers, whispered secrets, and the unshakable bond that only siblings could understand. Anna, the eldest, always carried herself with a sense of quiet responsibility. Even as a child, she took on the role of protector, ensuring that her younger sisters never strayed too far, never skinned their knees too badly, never cried for too long. She was the one who applied bandages to small cuts, who stayed up late to read stories by candlelight when thunderstorms frightened them, who reassured their mother that she would always look after them. She dreamed of becoming a doctor, of healing people, of bringing comfort through knowledge and skill. While other children played mindlessly, Anna practiced tying makeshift slings on her dolls and nursed sick kittens back to health. Sophia, the middle sister, was different. She was the heart of the family, full of warmth, always moving, always laughing. She loved the smell of fresh bread, the sound of bubbling soup on the stove, the feeling of flour dusting her fingertips. From a young age, she shadowed their mother in the kitchen, learning the art of kneading dough, of balancing flavors, of pouring love into each dish. If Anna was the protector, Sophia was the nurturer. She dreamed not of distant cities or grand ambitions, but of a home filled with warmth, of a life spent creating something tangible, something that could bring comfort to others. Liza, the youngest, was the dreamer. She saw the world in colors no one else could, sketching scenes in the margins of her school books, capturing fleeting moments with charcoal and paint. She had an artist's soul, one that craved beauty in every form. While her sisters found joy in order and routine, Liza found it in the unpredictable, in the unexpected twists of life. She could spend hours watching the way the light changed on the surface of the lake, the way the wind moved through the trees, the way expressions flickered across people's faces like shifting shadows. She believed that the world was too big to stay in one place forever. Their home was a place of warmth and love. Their parents, kind and steady, built a life around simple joys. Father carving wooden furniture in his workshop, mother teaching in the town's small school, both of them always making sure their daughters felt safe, loved, and free to dream. The house was always filled with the scent of something baking, with the sounds of stories being told, with the warmth of hands held together over the dinner table. It was a world that felt unbreakable. But childhood does not last forever. Anna was the first to leave. It was inevitable. She had worked too hard, studied too much, dreamed too long to stay in their small town. The acceptance letter to medical school arrived in the spring, and though it was a moment of triumph, it carried a weight none of them were ready to bear. The day she left, the house felt emptier, the spaces between them stretching wider than they ever had before. Their mother wiped her tears when she thought no one was looking. Their father hugged her a little too long at the train station, and Sophia and Liza waved until she was out of sight. That was the first time they truly understood what it meant to miss someone. Sophia stayed behind. Someone had to. The town was her home. The bakery she dreamed of was still just a dream, and their parents were growing older. She convinced herself that she was content, that not everyone was meant to leave. But in the quiet moments, she felt the absence of her sister like an ache, an unspoken longing for something she couldn't quite name. Liza, however, could not stay. She had always known she would leave, and when the opportunity came, a scholarship to a prestigious art academy abroad, she took it without hesitation. The night before her departure, she wandered through the house, memorizing every detail, every creak of the floorboards, every familiar scent. She knew she would not return the same. When she boarded her plane, she felt a rush of excitement, but beneath it, an unfamiliar sorrow settled in her chest. She was chasing her dreams, but in doing so, she was leaving behind the only world she had ever known. With Liza gone, the house grew quieter still. Their parents aged faster in their absence, their father's hands no longer as steady as they once were, their mother's hair streaked with more gray. Sophia did her best to fill the spaces they left behind, but she could not be both of them. The distance between the sisters stretched across continents, their childhood memories slowly becoming stories they told rather than experiences they shared. At first, they wrote letters, long, detailed accounts of their lives, of new experiences, of the little things they missed about home. But as time passed, the letters became shorter, the phone calls less frequent. Life had a way of pulling them in different directions. Anna was buried in her studies, Sophia was consumed by the demands of running a business, and Liza was lost in the world of art and exhibitions. They told themselves they would visit soon, that nothing had changed, that they were still the same girls who had grown up together by the lake. But time had already begun to change them. Years passed. They saw each other when they could. Holidays, special occasions, brief visits that never felt long enough. Their father's health declined, their mother grew frailer, and the house they had once filled with laughter now stood as a quiet reminder of the life they had left behind. Then came the final photograph with their mother. It was a rare moment when all three sisters were together again, standing side by side in front of the house that had shaped them. Their mother, though weaker than before, insisted on standing in the center, her hands resting on their shoulders, a smile on her lips that did not quite reach her eyes. It was the last time they would all be in the same frame. The following winter, she was gone. After the funeral, they sat together in the old living room, flipping through albums of photographs. Images of birthdays, summers by the lake, Christmas mornings, and quiet afternoons filled the pages. And then there was the last one, their mother between them, her smile frozen in time. They did not speak as they stared at it, each lost in their own thoughts. Liza was the first to break the silence. "We should take a picture. Every year. Together." Sophia and Anna looked at her. The idea was so simple, so small, yet it held something weighty, something unspoken. Sophia nodded first. And so the tradition began. The first time they stood together in front of the house after their mother's passing, the air felt thick with memories. It was autumn, and the leaves had started to turn, their colors brilliant against the pale sky. The house, once full of life, seemed quieter than ever. The absence of their mother was a wound they all felt, though none of them spoke of it. Liza had arrived first, stepping into rooms that felt untouched, as if time had hesitated to move forward without the woman who had been the heart of it. Sophia was next, bringing with her the scent of cinnamon and fresh bread, a habit she had picked up to comfort herself. Anna, the last to arrive, looked tired, as though the weight of her work had settled into her bones. It had been a long time since they had been together like this, without the pretense of a holiday or an obligation. They moved carefully around each other, trying to bridge the space that time had carved between them. It was Liza who pulled out the old camera, the same one their father had once used to take pictures of them as children. She wiped the dust from its surface and turned to her sisters. "We should take a picture, every year, together." At first, there was hesitation. Anna adjusted her coat, glancing toward the house as though searching for a reason to say no. Sophia sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face, her expression unreadable. But then she nodded, a slow, thoughtful movement, as if she understood what Liza was trying to preserve. Anna, after a long pause, nodded as well. They stood in front of the house, unsure at first where to place themselves. Liza looked through the lens and felt something shift. It was not just a photograph, it was a moment they were capturing, a way to hold on to something that was slipping through their fingers. The shutter clicked, and just like that, it began. In the first photograph, their expressions were careful, almost uncertain. They stood slightly apart, each carrying the weight of their own lives. Anna had the posture of someone who was used to taking charge. Sophia held her hands together as if holding on to something unseen, and Liza, though the one who had suggested it, looked as though she were trying to convince herself that it mattered. But when they looked at the image, something about it felt right. A silent agreement passed between them. They would do it again next year. And so they did. The second year, the sky was gray and the wind carried the sharp scent of approaching winter. They stood closer together this time, as if the months apart had made them eager to bridge the distance. Sophia had just opened her bakery, and flour still clung to the creases of her hands. Anna had begun working longer hours at the hospital, and exhaustion was evident in her eyes. Liza, fresh from an exhibition in another country, had cut her hair short, and it gave her a different, sharper look. The third year, they chose the same spot, standing before the house that now belonged to them but felt more like a relic than a home. This time, there was no hesitation, only the quiet understanding that they were holding on to something important. The small details changed. Sophia's apron was dusted with sugar instead of flour. Anna's shoulders carried a new weight. Liza's eyes held something unreadable. The years continued. With each photograph, the changes became more pronounced. Anna's hair, once always tied neatly back, had a streak of silver running through it. Sophia's hands, always busy, started to show the first signs of age, the faint lines of time's passage. Liza's face, once full of restless energy, softened in ways she hadn't expected. By the 10th year, the shift was undeniable. The way they stood together had changed. The space between them had disappeared. Their arms brushed against each other naturally. They no longer looked like three women who lived separate lives, but rather like a unit, like something that could not be broken. When they stood for their photograph that year, Sophia laughed as the wind caught her hair, and Liza caught Anna rolling her eyes in mock annoyance. Each year, the act of taking the photo became a ritual. They would arrive at the house, walk through the rooms that still smelled of their childhood, sit at the kitchen table with cups of coffee or tea, and talk about the things that had changed and the things that had stayed the same. Some years were harder than others. There were years where one of them almost didn't come, where the weight of life pressed too heavily. One year, Anna had lost a patient she had fought desperately to save, and she almost canceled. saying she couldn't bear to smile for a picture when the weight of failure clung to her. But Sophia and Liza waited. They knew she would come. And she did. One year, Liza had just gone through a painful breakup, and her usual brightness was dimmed. Sophia and Anna didn't ask for details. They simply stood closer to her when the camera clicked. One year, Sophia nearly missed the tradition because the bakery had suffered financial trouble and she was consumed with worry. But she arrived, her hands still dusted with flour, and when they stood together, the strain in her face softened. And then came the year their father asked to be in the photograph. His hair had turned completely white, his shoulders not as broad as they once were, but his eyes still held the same warmth. He stood at the center of them, his daughters by his side, and for the first time in years they felt whole again. That was the last photograph they took with him. After he was gone, the house became something different. No longer a place of comfort, but a place of memories. A structure that contained echoes of laughter, whispers of childhood secrets, shadows of those who had once lived within its walls. The tradition, however, did not stop. If anything, it became more important. Each year, they stood together, even when it was difficult, even when life tried to pull them in different directions. They began to notice things they hadn't before, the way they aged, the way their expressions changed, the way time etched itself onto their faces in ways they could not control. They saw how, in the earliest photographs, they had all looked like individuals standing side by side, but as the years passed, their bodies leaned into one another, their hands naturally found each other's shoulders. Their gazes softened in ways that only familiarity and love could allow. And then, one year, something was different. Sophia was paler than usual, thinner, as if the vibrancy she carried had been dimmed just slightly. She waved off their concerns, saying it was nothing, just stress, just the exhaustion of running a business. But when they took the photograph that year, Liza noticed the way Anna's hand lingered on Sophia's back, the way her own grip tightened just slightly around Sophia's arm. They did not know it then, but that would be the last photograph where they stood together as they always had. Something was changing, and time, no matter how tightly they tried to hold on to it, was moving forward. The year Sophia's illness became undeniable. The air seemed heavier, the sky a little duller, as if the world itself understood that something was shifting. She had always been the one who carried warmth, the sister who baked their favorite pastries when they arrived, who hugged them first, who always found a way to smooth the sharp edges of life. But now she looked tired, though she still smiled the same way she always had. The illness had crept in quietly, unnoticed at first, disguised as mere exhaustion, as stress, as the natural wear of a woman who had spent years standing over a hot oven, kneading dough, waking up before dawn to run the bakery that had become her life. It was Liza who saw it first, though she did not want to believe it. The way Sophia's hands trembled slightly when she lifted a cup of tea, the way her clothes seemed to fit differently, looser. Anna, ever the doctor, noticed too, though she said nothing at first. Perhaps she did not want to give it power by naming it, by confirming what deep down she already suspected. Perhaps she thought she could fix it, could fight it before it became something real. But Sophia knew. She had known for some time, had gone to the doctor alone, had received the news in sterile white rooms with cold chairs and blank walls. She had held the knowledge in her heart, carrying it like a secret she was not yet ready to share. When she finally told them, it was with the same calmness with which she had always spoken. No dramatics, no fear in her voice, just the quiet acceptance of a truth she had come to terms with before them. Anna's reaction was the sharpest. She did not cry, did not allow herself the release of grief. Instead, she fell into motion, into planning, into research. She spoke of treatments, of options, of doctors she could call, of procedures that could buy time. It was her way of coping, of pretending she had control over something that had already set its course. Liza, ever the dreamer, refused to believe it at all, convinced that if they just willed it away, it would disappear. She clung to the idea that there were miracles, that things like this did not happen to people like Sophia, to sisters who still had so much time left. But Sophia, in her quiet way, had already made peace with it. That year, when they stood for their photograph, there was something different in the way they positioned themselves. Anna stood close, her hand firm against Sophia's back, as if she could hold her up, keep her steady. Liza's arm looped around Sophia's, her fingers gripping just a little tighter than before. Sophia, though weaker, stood between them as she always had, smiling, because this was their tradition, and it was not to be broken. The months that followed were a blur of hospital visits, of long nights filled with whispered conversations that neither of them ever wanted to have. Anna, ever the pragmatist, spoke of statistics, of possibilities, of hope tied to numbers and science. Liza sat by Sophia's bed sketching, capturing her in quiet moments in ways she could not with words. Sophia, as always, was the one comforting them, telling them it was okay, that this was life, that time had never been theirs to control. There came a point when Sophia could no longer travel to the house for their yearly ritual. The bakery, once filled with the scent of fresh bread, now sat in silence. The doors remained closed more often than they were open, and though customers still came, the heart of the place had dimmed. The town knew, in the way small towns always knew, that something was changing, that something irreplaceable was slipping away. That year, instead of bringing Sophia to the house came to her. Anna and Liza arrived with the camera, carrying with them the weight of years, of memories, of all the photographs that had come before. They found her sitting in the sunroom, wrapped in a soft blanket, her body thinner than ever, but her eyes still bright. They arranged themselves around her, one on each side, holding onto her hands, pressing close. When the shutter clicked, there were no words, no forced smiles, only the quiet understanding that this moment would be one they would hold on to forever. The following spring, Sophia was gone. The bakery closed its doors for the first time in years, the smell of warm bread replaced by the silence of loss. The town mourned in its own way, leaving flowers at the doorstep, lighting candles in the windows. Anna and Liza stood in the empty space, feeling the absence in every corner, in every place where Sophia had once been. The house, their house, now belonged to just the two of them. The tradition, their tradition, felt heavier than it ever had before. That autumn, when it came time to take the annual photograph, they almost didn't. It felt wrong to stand there without her, to see the space where she should have been. But as they stood in front of the house, something instinctive made them move closer, their shoulders touching, their hands finding each other. The camera clicked, capturing the first photograph where one of them was missing. It was the hardest picture they had ever taken. But they knew, as they looked at it, that the tradition had to continue. For her, for all of them. The absence of Sophia was something neither of them could fully accept, though they carried it with them every day. The world had not stopped, though it felt like it should have. The bakery was sold, its windows dark now, its ovens cold. The house remained, though it, too, felt emptier, as if the walls had absorbed the loss and now echoed with memories rather than life. Anna and Liza returned that year because they had to, because to break the tradition now would mean admitting that time had won, that Sophia was truly gone in every way. Neither of them wanted to face the moment, but both knew they could not run from it. The house stood the same, untouched and waiting. The garden, once Sophia's favorite place to sit on warm afternoons, had begun to grow wild, the edges untamed, as if it, too, had stopped being tended the way it once was. The kitchen smelled only of dust now. There was no fresh bread, no warmth rising from the stove, no quiet humming as Sophia worked. Liza sat at the table for a long time, tracing her fingers over the wooden surface, remembering all the times they had gathered there, the laughter, the stories, the way Sophia always poured tea first before anyone else could. Anna moved through the house like a ghost, checking each room without knowing what she was looking for. When the time came to take the photograph, it felt different. For years, they had known their places, moving without thinking, their positions ingrained in them like second nature. But now, without Sophia between them, there was only space. They stood for a long time before Liza finally reached out, pulling Anna closer, filling the emptiness as best as she could. The camera clicked. The image was captured. They did not need to look at it to know what it showed. Two women standing where three once had, their grief woven into the way they leaned toward each other, into the way their hands gripped just a little tighter. The following year, they did not discuss whether they would return. They simply did. It had become more than just a tradition now. It was an unspoken promise, something they could not let go of no matter how painful it was. The years had begun leaving their marks more visibly now. Anna's hair, once only streaked with silver, had become almost fully gray. Liza, always the dreamer, had lost some of the lightness in her step, though she still carried her sketchbook wherever she went. Their bodies were changing, their faces carrying the years in ways they could no longer ignore. They never spoke about it, but they saw it in the photographs, the subtle shifts, the way time settled into their skin. One year, the weather was colder than usual. Liza arrived first, as she always did, unlocking the door and stepping into the house that now belonged to just the two of them. It had remained empty since Sophia's passing, though they had never been able to bring themselves to sell it. They still cleaned it, still kept it in order, though it was clear that no one truly lived there anymore. Anna arrived later, carrying a small bag, though she never stayed long. They spent the evening, as they always did, sitting at the table, drinking tea, speaking in quiet tones about their lives, about things that did not matter as much as the things they left unsaid. When they took the photograph that year, something had changed. There was no longer hesitation, no longer an effort to fill the space where Sophia had once been. Instead, they stood close, the way sisters who have shared a lifetime of loss and love do, their bodies leaning into one another naturally. The pain had not disappeared, but it had softened into something else, something almost like peace. Time continued its steady march forward. The years passed, and the photographs continued. Some years were harder than others. There was a year when Liza almost did not come, feeling the weight of exhaustion too heavily on her shoulders. There was a year when Anna had fallen ill, her strength no longer what it once was, but she arrived anyway because she had promised, because this was something they did not break. Each time they stood before the camera, they saw it, how time shaped them, how their faces changed, how their bodies grew smaller, frailer, how their hands, once steady and strong, had begun to tremble. Then came the year when Liza was alone. She had known it was coming, had known for months that Anna's body was growing weaker, that the years had taken their toll in ways even the strongest among them could not fight. Still, when the time came, when she stood alone before the house, the weight of it was almost unbearable. She set the camera as she always had, but when she moved into place she hesitated. The absence of her sisters, first one and now the other, felt like a void too great to fill. But she stayed. She stood in front of the house and let the camera capture what remained. In the photograph, there was only one figure now, standing where three once had. Her hair had turned completely silver, her shoulders not as straight as they had once been. But her eyes, though weary, still held something steady, something unbroken. She looked at the photograph afterward, sitting alone at the kitchen table, the house silent around her. She did not cry. She only traced the image with her fingers, remembering. And then, carefully, she placed it with all the others, knowing that next year she would return. Because the tradition had never been about stopping time. It had never been about holding on to what could not be kept. It had always been about remembering. And as long as she stood in front of that house, the story of the three sisters would never truly end. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out more videos on the channel, and if this one resonated with you, share it with someone who would appreciate it too.